Hello! Today we're talking about half rectangle triangles, or HRTs. These can be a little intimidating if you've never done it before, but with a little practice, you'll be making them with no problem at all. We start with two rectangles of the same size. Mark a diagonal line on the back side of the lightest color rectangle from corner to corner. Place the two rectangles together, lining up the opposing corners, right sides together. Now we're going to sew on each side of that marked line 1/4 inch away from the line. Then cut on the marked line. Now we press the seam allowance open. I have the seam allowance pressed open, and you can see looking at these two HRTs that whether I turn it right side up or upside down, the seam runs the same direction. If you want to have a seam running the opposite direction, you're going to need to mark the line in the opposite direction to start. I'm going to make one in the opposite orientation now. So I'm going to take my pencil and start by following the same procedure, but marking the line in the opposite direction. Instead of marking it this way, I'm going to mark it the opposite direction, connecting the other two corners. So I'll line up the corners again, the opposing corners of the top and bottom rectangle, sew 1/4 inch away from that line, and cut on the marked line. Then we press our seam allowance open, and you can see that the seam orientation is now going the opposite direction. So with our seam allowances pressed open, we're ready to trim our HRTs to the correct size. So we're going to mark our chosen size with tape onto a quilting ruler. I'm going to be trimming this one to 5.5 inches by 3 inches. Once our shape is marked on the quilting ruler, we're going to take a Sharpie and mark a point 1/4 inch in from each corner. This marks the seam allowance point when your HRT is sewn into the quilt. Now we're going to take our ruler and place it on the HRT, and we're going to line up those dots with this diagonal seam line. We're going to line those up. And if your ruler fits on your HRT a little bit crooked in order to make those line up, that's all right. So line those dots up with the seam line, and then we're going to trim off the extra fabric on the right and the top sides of the ruler. Now, turn your block around, line up the bottom and the left side of your block with those taped lines. And line up the red dots, or whatever color you used, with the seam line. Again, and then trim off the extra again on the right hand and the top. To trim an HRT with the opposite orientation, just do it the exact same way, but use the other two dots to line up with your seam line. Flip it around and line up the bottom and the left side and trim it again. And there you have it. One thing to notice about a correctly trimmed HRT is the seam will not run directly through the corners of your block. There'll be a little gap between the corner and the seam line. But once it's sewn into the quilt, that seam should run directly through the corner for a perfect point. Thanks for joining me today. This is Lisa Lund from Shadow Valley Quilts. Happy quilting!